Hello and welcome to Liz Gregory, who is the head, now correct me if I'm wrong, the head of child and family psychology. Is that right?
I'm the joint head. I job share with Rachel Williams.
Fantastic. And it's so good of you to join me today and be part of a broader conversation that really is about thinking about how we work around trauma, around adversity, and how we make a difference in the world for the people that we're working with. So thank you very much for agreeing to go on.
It's nice to see you face to face rather than tweet to tweet.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah. And so I always start off by going, so how did we meet? So how did we meet, Liz?
Well, definitely on Twitter for sure. Followed your work very closely. Been really, really interested in what you've got to say, and found lots and lots and lots of common ground, which is, has actually been my experience on Twitter generally, and has been a really positive experience.
Yes, because a lot of people are very reluctant to go on Twitter, but I have mixed feelings about it sometimes. But in terms of actually pulling people together across disciplines, across sectors, I think Twitter has that real opportunity to do that, and essentially for many years I've felt that that's one of the sort of missing parts of the jigsaw, is how do we join people up together so that we're thinking interdisciplinary and also intersector.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And what I love about Twitter is that I had no idea of your professional background. I just knew that you were working in the field, and I liked what you had to say. And I think that connection where it really kind of pushes past professional boundaries and gets to the bottom of what really matters in our work has been really positive from my perspective.
Well, thank you. And what I really was interested in, so while we've been busy living in this alternative universe known as Twitter, and watching some of the conversations, and you write extensive blogs, and I will put a link in the comments underneath, really is around CAMHS. So you've really been part of designing CAMHS in a different way, I think, or certainly been part of a broader team looking at how, because we hear all the time, don't we, CAMHS doesn't do this, and I'm on the waiting list for 10 years and they've never helped and they've never done anything. And that whole kind of managing expectations or even mismanaging perhaps, what is CAMHS, what can it actually do, what are the gaps, and how do we create a better service? That's what I see as your domain. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely my passion in a nutshell. And obviously, I've just kind of come to Twitter in the last couple of years, really. But this work has been going on for many, many years. And it's not just my work, it's the work of our whole team and also our whole partnership across all agencies in our region. So it feels really important to make that really clear. And I suppose from my perspective, I think that we've been building over a long period of time much better joint working and much better solutions for children and young people. But because they're not the traditional CAMHS model, they often get lost and they often sit under the radar, and they don't get the same input or funding, and people have to then they're on short-term contracts and they have to bid for money, etc., etc. And I was really, really keen to get these areas of working that, there's many of them actually recognised and talked about as CAMHS, as well as the more specialist services. And I think in our area, that's developed really quite strongly for a whole range of reasons. I think we work into 5 boroughs, that's 5 local authorities, so we're one health board having to make relationships across 5 areas, and those 5 areas are really, really different. And when you've worked in very different geographical patches with very different communities and very different needs, you can't help but realise that it's not a one-size-fits-all, that you've got to adapt services and think about the issues that are relevant for your families that you're seeing in your area. And so that's why we've been much more creative, I think, in trying to think much more wider than just what happens in a clinic. And we've also had a lot of frustration because inevitably CAMHS is overwhelmed. And whenever we're overwhelmed, we shut down. And unfortunately, I think because it's dominated by health, it's shut down around mental disorder, which is a very medicalised way of thinking about children's distress, and risks us not looking at the wider context, not thinking about relationships. It risks really locating the problem in the child, and we've been very frustrated about that for a number of years, but equally with our colleagues, really wanting to recognise that we have to manage needs somehow, and we have to manage resources. So how can you not shut down around particular groups of children without actually feeling overwhelmed as a service? And I think by coming together and having those conversations, we've been able to reach more creative solutions.
I love the way you talked about the service in the way that it is as a microcosm of a human. You know, it's overwhelmed, so it kind of shuts down just the way that we do. And I think that's a really lovely, helpful way of thinking about what happens to services that are full of humans and how they're working with other humans and how that works.
Definitely. That culture within a service is so significant, I think, to the help that we're able to offer and the solutions we're able to come to when we're faced with really quite overwhelming problems.
Yeah, and you know, that whole kind of medicalising distress is part of a history that we have, you know, in terms of thinking about emotional pain. And I like to think that we're on a spectrum of movement with that, and we're heading in a distance away from it. How far do you think we are on that spectrum? Because I'm a bit of an optimist, so I tend to think we're doing great, and then I have a look at some conversations or some comments on articles and stuff like that, and I think, oh my goodness, we are. And also what's going on in a lot of schools, of course, around the way that I mean, we've just found out 10 million quid, for example, has been handed out to somebody to oversee behaviour management and control, someone who's very passionate about zero tolerance. So that makes me think, oh my goodness, we're not moving on the spectrum. I mean, what's your kind of view? And I know you're in Wales as well, so we have to locate you.
Yeah, I feel really positive and really optimistic. I've worked in services for over 20 years, and I don't think I've ever felt quite so excited to go to work. And I think that is because a lot of things have come together. So the irony of this is I don't think that within our service, within our school team, that we're saying anything very different to what we've been saying for 20 years. But now people are much more open to listening to it, but also joining us in finding better solutions. So I think it is that coming together that's been really, really significant for us. And our partnership board has been central to that. But of course, you know, as with anything, things can spiral up or spiral down. And I think we're at a point where actually what we're doing is spiraling up. And we're getting a lot of support from Welsh Government. We've had transformation funding to really boost what we're trying to achieve in our area. We've got the model that we're using has been written into Mind Over Matter, which is the advice to Welsh Government about the direction that CAMHS should be going in. And then locally, whereas there's been a number of barriers over the years for, you know, as I was saying, very understandable reasons. It's about demand and it's about feeling overwhelmed, I think, and the shutters go up. But I think there's been a recognition that that's not going to help in the long term, that we all need to compromise, we all need to work a bit differently, we all need to put children and families right at the heart of what we're doing and listen really carefully to what they're saying. And I think that's been so powerful. And one of the things that has really helped us is our programme Together for Children and Young People have been drawing on some work that Havel did, asking young people what they want from CAMHS services. And you know, they said lots of really helpful things, as they always do, but two of the central things I think that have made a huge difference is they said, don't medicalise growing up, which is just, you know, out of the mouths of babes, you know, so important and so valuable a lesson for all of us. And they also said, help the people who are closest to us to understand mental health so that they can help us. And those are gifts, I think, because we can do that. We can really do that. But it does mean changing that lens that we think services have to be organised in.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I mean, I love that you've placed those lived experience voices, if you like, and actually their lived experience is that they're a young person or a child. And actually placing people differently in terms of understanding services and what we're offering, because I think this medicalisation of growing up is a really interesting one. Thinking about some of the things that I've seen, I have had reactions to, particularly where what I've seen are sometimes young people describing anxiety, but that's a very normal experience of anxiousness. And how do we help people feel more comfortable with those very normal feelings of sad days, feeling anxious, and when does that become something that's really problematic? And how do we help people understand that? I mean, how do we help people make sense of, and when did that stop? When did it, I think about, I was a young person in the 80s, and I think about Morrissey in his bedroom weeping, just kind of, and I just wonder, what has created that shift? Has it got worse? Have people become more medicalised about very normal feelings, or is it because of we don't talk about it enough, or we talk about it too much? I mean, what's your view on that?
Yeah, wouldn't that be a fantastic question to find the answer to? I think there are so many factors, and I always kind of try and stand back and look at the direction of travel that we've been in. I think there is an irony that back in 2001, we launched Everybody's Business in Wales, which was really about making children's mental health everybody's business. And we signed up to that wholeheartedly. And yet here we are, 20 years on, and it feels like it's gone more and more down a medicalised route, and the help is only available if you meet these particular criteria. And so I often wonder about how we got to that point. And I think the intention and the belief that mental health should be everybody's business, and we all have mental health, and it needs more or less help at various points in time throughout all of our lives. We did believe that back then, but I think that came at a time when services were under huge pressure, and so we had to compartmentalise everything that we did. And if it wasn't commissioned, then you didn't do it, and you were pulled back from that way of working. And even and that's us as mental health professionals, but even our colleagues in physical health, the school health nurses would be available to talk and to support young people, but then they were pulled in because their job became immunisation and all sorts of other things that meant that everything started getting compartmentalized up. And I see that as a big factor. And I also think that children and young people are under huge stress and pressure in their everyday lives. And I really recognize that. And I was very privileged that I had the opportunity to spend 3 years in Canada and bring my children up there. And they were 9 and 12 when we moved, and 12 and 15 when we came back. And just the wall of pressure that my 15-year-old came back into when he hit year 10 and GCSE season. But it wasn't just him. I couldn't go to a drinks party with friends or out for a meal without them being completely fixated on the results and exams and that culture. And that's really, really different, A, to how it was when I was growing up in the 80s, and B, how it is for young people in Canada, where it's just not, they go to school, they get assessed, they leave. Do you know what I mean? It's not what it's become in the UK. So I think there's layers and layers and layers of things that make a difference.
I think that's so important, what you've just said. I think there is a cultural element, definitely. And I'd also be interested, because I know we don't really have any kind of conclusive evidence on this, but I'd be interested on the impact of social media, the impact, on what that, not just the content, but the ability to have what you want in terms of knowledge, information, connection connection in the moment, and how that wires you up differently when you can't get an answer. I mean, I know, for example, sometimes if I don't pick up the phone, then it will go and go and go and go and go until I do. From one of my kids in particular. Bless her. So on that makes me quite curious, in terms of thinking about this, if you can't get hold of somebody right now. And I just wonder how that impacts upon people. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't posing that question to you as if you have the answer. It's massive, but it's an interesting exploration, isn't it?
Yeah. And, again, from a very optimistic perspective, social media is part of our lives. We need to learn to live with it and embrace the positives that it brings, as well as the potential downsides. And I think, that's the same about just about everything else in life, isn't it? Of course, it's got its shadow, but to put it as the reason, I think, it's a factor in amongst so many other things.
Yeah.
To be aware of. And for that one young person, that one individual who can't switch off from it, then of course it has a really, really significant impact. But for all young people, it's probably somewhere in a much bigger continuum of other things that are contributing as well. And it's always that thing, isn't it, of the big lens and then the focusing on what's your story, what's your individual story, what's your individual relationship to social media, why is it so big and so important for you, what's behind that is always what we need to be doing, I think, with young people.
Yeah, I love that balanced view, and that certainly came across when I interviewed Cyber Trauma. She was very much of the same thing. What are the conversations people are actually having about why you might be on there all the time? Why are you finding it difficult to turn it off? And ensuring that we have that curiosity built into those conversations. So what have been your really kind of big wins, or what was your first sort of big win where you thought, right, we are now, because I'm a bit like you, I've been around for a very long time as well, and I'm very enthusiastic about the trajectory at the moment. I really am, and I feel like it's just exponentially going up and up and up. But what was the first thing that happened where you thought, there's something different going on right now?
Well, I'm going to quote Canada again, and I know it's very annoying that I had that opportunity, but I think, I came back after 3 years away, and I remember sitting in our partnership board, and they just really started to form before I left, and it was another meeting. There were 5 local authorities, health, public health, the whole range of people, and we were polite but defensive and protective and all of those things. And I came back and sat in the meeting, and I think just by being away I could take a bit more of a meta perspective on what was happening, and just the quality of the conversations were different, the feeling in the room was different, there was more laughter, there was more a much more kind of relaxed atmosphere, but also a lot of business was getting done. And I think there's no shortcut to that. It takes time and it takes relationships. And I think that for me made me realise that we were in a different zone, that we could actually push things a little bit more as a partnership board, because those relationships were really building on solid ground, whereas they've been more tentative and more cautious before.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. It's always the basics, isn't it? Let's get the relationship right, and then it's amazing what we can do. So in terms of actually practical service changes, so you've got your relationships now, so now you're going to try and create something between you. What did you create?
Well, and again, it's not me. I speak absolutely as part of a much bigger team, both in terms of our local psychology service, but our wider partnership board as well. And I think, we had pockets of money that were coming through for partnership funding. So you had to prioritise jointly, you had to work out what was going to be your focus. And there is nothing like bidding for a joint pot of money for sharpening in on what it is you want to achieve. And so there were a range of things, and again, this happened when I was away, but it was really beginning to develop momentum. But one big difference, I think, came as a result of a very significant presentation that one of our psychologists did to the partnership board, and she'd done some work jointly with another psychologist in terms of getting the material together. And what they've done was they've gone through in incredibly finite detail, and I can't underestimate how much time it took, but I think it was about 16 files of children who've been placed out of CAMHS, and tracked back each and every point on that journey that kind of led to the next step. And really, through doing that, presented to the partnership board that so much more could have been done so much earlier on to change the journey that that young person was on, if only services could be organised a bit differently. And I think that gave the framework for thinking, right, what are we going to do, and where are we going to do it along that trajectory, and how are we going to get there? So there was a big vision, I think, that developmentally children are on the same journey, they need the same things, and some may be a bit more complex, but they're not radically different to other children. And if we get the right supports, then we can use that to give them a better opportunity of staying close to home and being where they need to be. So that was one example. Linked to that, again, we had a pot of money and went to the partnership board and said we could, it was money badged as therapy money. And we said that we could use this to employ a couple of therapists and provide some therapy for some of our most vulnerable children. Or we could use this and develop a team that undertakes really extensive training and support for all of our frontline childcare professionals, so that they're better able to contain and support young people who are struggling. And I think it was really quite a shift in our partnership board, and the usual send them for therapy and fix these kids, that we've been so used to hearing and struggling with over the years, that they went for this team, this Gwent attachment team, to actually support and train frontline staff. And that felt like a big shift, really. It was recognising that we've all got something very, very significant to offer these children and young people, and that therapy is only a small part of that, but actually if we get the support around that young person right, we can achieve so much more. So that felt like quite a significant development.
That's huge. I mean, I guess that's kind of the bigger picture, really, isn't it, in terms of how do we see therapeutic interventions? What does that mean? What does relational safety mean? Who has the opportunities to create relational safety, to offer a therapeutic space that is informal? I mean, my hope is that lots of people who work in CAMHS services will watch this and will be able to get something from it in terms of thinking about how they think about their services, just in the sense that, because I'm fortunate enough to travel around the country, that it's very different everywhere. The way it's provided, the way it's thought about, the way it's pulled together, the way it works, what it offers, what the waiting lists are. I mean, like you said at the beginning, every area is so different, and I know that lots of areas really, really struggle. And I love that you all had the humility, if you like, and wherewithal to come together and think, right, this isn't really working. How do we do this? And I'm interested particularly in thinking about mental health and well-being outside of a CAMHS context, and how is that done well in schools, and how might it not be done so well in schools?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, this has just grown momentum, really. So those were the foundations and the building blocks, and the fact that we could have those sorts of conversations and everybody reach a consensus that that's what we needed to do. And as I say, coming back from Canada and observing that was a huge positive shift from my perspective, but something that had really worried me and troubled me, that was that within health specifically, as opposed to the partnership arena, there was more and more of a focus on within child models of intervention. And so the evidence-based practice was really dominating what was being offered and what was being commissioned. And I felt quite worried about that, really, as we all did in our service. And we wanted to write something or just make a statement or, you know, do our bit, not really thinking that we would make a huge difference, but, you know, that at least we'd said, from a specialist mental health perspective, it's got to be wider than that. We've got to think about the whole system. And it was during one of those conversations where we were trying to think, right, what are we going to say, that a model just fell onto my page. And I just knew when I saw it that it really summed up what we were trying to achieve in our partnership board, and it really described the gaps in services if we just did more of the same and just poured more into specialist mental health services. And so we refer to it as the iceberg model, because basically what it's saying is that the triangle at the top of specialist services has an equal and equivalent level of need that can never be met by clinic-based interventions. And that's where often our most troubled and vulnerable children are. And that's really where the adverse childhood experiences research helped our cause in a way, because although we've known and been working with these children for many, many years and developing tiny little pockets of services, that research really said, hey, this is big stuff and potentially impacts on society in a significant way. So it just gave us a route in to talk about the work that we've been doing. You know, we would call it children with developmental trauma, or children whose family context is struggling to support them, or what, you know, all sorts of other things. But the adverse childhood experiences research really helped to give us another angle of saying, look, we need to develop support and interventions for these children and young people. And we came at it from a number of angles, really. And when we had the potential to bid for transformation funding, we were able to put layers of intervention service. So we're not saying that there's one answer to this, there's not one silver bullet at all, but what we're trying to achieve with the iceberg model is a whole systems approach. And so in terms of the services that we're developing, and again, we had pockets of examples of these, so we weren't just doing them from scratch, but we said, if we had that, but we rolled it out everywhere, if we had that and we rolled it out everywhere, what difference would that make? And so it ranged from infant mental health services right down to the bottom tip of the iceberg, and children who are placed out of county because they can't be contained within their own communities. And again, we had pockets of services that were demonstrating really effective interventions for these children and young people. And because we had the opportunity, we also put in the whole school approach as part of that agenda too, saying what happens in school is just as important. And again, it's early days and we've only got bits of money, and we're not going to, you know, we're not going to say that we're going to change everything. But I think that the fact that we're having these conversations as a whole partnership board and everybody's included in them is the transformational bit, actually, that I see my role as important in supporting the whole school approach, as I see teachers, head teachers, educational psychologists. You know, we've all got to be part of that solution. But the key is getting the right philosophy running through all of the services, I think.
That strikes me as an absolutely fabulous place to come to a close, you know, having everyone working together, all kind of working from the same kind of philosophy. And that's certainly the tribe that I want to be in. So
you are.
I am, yes, I am. I'm very, very lucky and get to meet fantastic people like yourself. And if just before we close, it seems prudent to say, what would be your kind of your parting gift to people, or piece of wisdom, or what would you like to leave people with? What thought would you like to leave people with before we close?
I think, you know, the obvious one that springs to mind is the power of relationships. These are complex problems, but they're so much easier to solve when we try and put them together.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. You've been amazing. I will catch up with you very soon on Twitter, no doubt.
Thank you, Lisa. Cheerio.
Yes, bye.